Welcome to a webinar for the Centre for Child Protection at the University of Kent, and we're here to really focus on Dr. Alice Loving's research with consideration of parent-infant intervention, with a particular focus on attachment and trauma. And we wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the centre. One moment, sorry, it's there we are, finally. So we wanted to give you a bit of an overview. We're actually coming up to our 10th anniversary next year, and we wanted to, I think, acknowledge the contribution of the two founders and initial directors of the centre. So we have Professor David Chemmings and Professor Jane Reeves, and they really established the centre to get to the heart of training and thinking around child protection. Their focus was really on making sure that we had good relationships between practice and academia, and working on innovative and new ways of tackling really complex work. So they were really the kind of trailblazers. And this kind of pioneering approach, I think, is reflected in the work that the centre has done and it continues to do. So we have a whole suite of really cutting edge simulations. So we are active around serious gaming and how that can have impact and influence on practice, and also thinking about how we work directly with children and young people. We have an MA in advanced child protection that has been very successful, and that's very much a kind of multidisciplinary focus. So we have people that work from across the UK and internationally on that. We run an annual conference. We're active as researchers, and we support training to lots and lots of people. So obviously we want to engage, and so we have activity like webinars. So the Centre for Child Protection is within SSPSSR within the University of Kent, and it combines research, distance learning programmes, innovative training. So we've got lots and lots of different activity within this centre. And I think that does reflect the challenges that child protection throws up both nationally and internationally. So it's an opportunity for us to work across kind of disciplinary boundaries with academics and practitioners. So there's no hierarchy. We're very much about kind of inclusion, working with service users, working with young people, working with colleagues across the university and beyond. The whole focus of the Centre for Child Protection has been very much around a kind of 360-degree perspective of child protection. That's really reflected in the master's programme. So those viewpoints are all equally important. So that academic practitioner and organisational focus is really key to everything that we do. And I think Alice is likely to kind of pick up on some of those themes about how we can work productively. We're also very keen on kind of thinking about the impact of technology on the work that we do and on children. And so again, we're thinking very much about global perspectives in child protection and how we work with abuse internationally as well as nationally. So we have really interesting voices from organisations, NGOs from other countries that are active within our programme and within the kind of research that we undertake. When we think about our teaching style, the suite of simulations we actually embed within the training and teaching that we do. So it's really to bring those kind of the complexities to the fore. So instead of having a huge divide between kind of academic knowledge base and practice knowledge base, it really brings those things very clearly together. So it nurtures kind of complex skills and knowledge acquisition. We think it's important to have that kind of reflective critical analysis, but also think about direct work skills. So we want anybody that's working with us, particularly on the master's programme, to really go back into their practice, and we want to see those impacts in practice, application of the kind of teaching that we're doing. So thinking about how we can develop that directly with people. What do our students say? So we've got a couple of quotes here, and like I say, it's very much an interdisciplinary, multi-agency establishment within the master's programme. And interestingly, lots and lots of people that are on the programme, you know, we learn a lot from them. So it's not a one-way street. They are incredibly well-developed practitioners and managers. So we often have really interesting dialogue with them. And the first quote's from a barrister that participated in the programme. And this particular student obviously had a deep understanding of child protection within the context of the law. But what they actually found really interesting was understanding those complexities from different perspectives. And again, I think that is reflected in the assistant head quote here. Where actually, you know, these were really useful. These had real life application, and that's really the focus for everything that we do, whether it's simulation, research, postgraduate study. It's really about how we interact with this knowledge base. So the way in which the centre established the MA in Advanced Child Protection was very much in keeping with thinking about a group of practitioners that were already very experienced, that were working in practice settings. So it's delivered online, it's delivered part-time, so it offers people real flexibility from that distance learning perspective, but also ensures that we are engaging with practice. So we have real opportunity to hear those voices and reflect back the most up-to-date and relevant research evidence and evidence-informed information to inform practice. So it's very much a two-way street. The modules are designed to, I think, sit alongside those really, really busy, complex lives. But we bring people back in through forums online and in person to have those really interesting debates and develop discourse. If you are interested in any of the activity at the Centre for Child Protection, then please do look at our University of Kent website for the Centre for Child Protection, or feel free to contact the team members. Obviously, you've been introduced this morning to key members of the Centre for Child Protection. We are always interested in having discussions. If you want any information, this is a kind of community of practice, so do come and speak to us about the MA or anything else that's happening at the centre. Okay, so without further ado, I'll be handing over to Dr. Alice Loving. If you could keep your audio off, that would be brilliant. I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you do have any questions that you would like to ask at the end of the presentation, then do feel free to put those in the chat, or indeed at the end of the presentation, if you want to ask those directly to Alice, then I'm sure she'd be more than happy to respond. So welcome, and yes, welcome to the Centre for Child Protection, welcome to the webinar, and I'll hand directly over to Alice.
Thank you, Isabel. I'll just bring up my slides. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us this morning to hear about my PhD research findings. I am really pleased to have kind of got back in touch with this material, because relatively shortly after completing the PhD, I had my daughter, so that kind of put a bit of a break in my connection with my findings. So it's been really nice to get back in touch with that for putting this webinar together. So this is the title of my actual thesis, Attachment, Trauma and Parenting in Social Work Practice. And I have actually got a link on the very last slide. If you have a spare, I don't know, day to read 100,000 words, then it's readily available online. But equally, if there's parts of the results when I'm talking about the findings that you sort of would like to hear a bit more about, in particular quotes, you know, from parents, which I felt were a really powerful piece of this work. If you'd like to kind of just skip to my results section, you can read some of that, because that's a part of this sort of research and social work that I found once I started this project was often missing. You know, really hearing from the perspective of parents, and I was really fortunate that I felt that I kind of got a real grasp of that and a real depth to that in this project. So do feel free to click on that link and just find sections that you might think would be helpful for you. Okay, so the actual central research question for me was, what factors affect the parental experience and outcomes of parent-infant intervention? So to break that down for clarification, in terms of parent-infant intervention, what I'm talking about there is parents who were involved with social services, who had a baby who was on a child protection plan, because most of the participants in this study, they had young babies, newly born babies. So the intervention for them was that they were requested by social services to go into a parent-infant foster placement, or to go into a residential setting, or to actually have parent-infant psychotherapy. So that was the intervention that they had experienced. So I wanted to know about what that experience was like for them, but also the outcome after receiving that intervention. So by outcome in this context, I mean they were then involved in a process with social services whereby within a period of about 6 months, because most of them were in proceedings, the outcome was whether or not they were going to be returning to the community with their babies, or whether their babies would be permanently removed from their care. So that's what I mean by outcome, and that's what I mean by intervention. So just to break that down to be a little bit clearer, in terms of my participants, I had 17 that took part in this research, which for me was a really solid number by the end. Recruitment was one of the hardest tasks of this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But I was really pleased to have got 5 males and 12 females. Even to just have 5 males, again, when you delve deeper into social work research, you realise that often the male voice is quite missing. So I felt really fortunate to have had those 5 dads want to take part in this project. So 2 of the parents were having parent-infant psychotherapy. So again, they had a child on a child protection plan, and they were involved in a parenting assessment process, but they were receiving parent-infant psychotherapy on a weekly basis. One of the parents was receiving parent-infant psychotherapy, but they also were in a foster placement. Then I had 5 parents that were just in foster placements, and I had 9 parents that were in residential assessment units. So that was the split of the kind of intervention type that I'm referring to. So in terms of my participant criteria, they needed to have had an attachment-based trauma history. So they themselves in their own childhood had experienced extreme abuse and or neglect themselves by their primary caregivers. That they had a child on a child protection plan, and some of them were attending parent-infant psychotherapy. The reason why I had this split between what was local authority-based participants and parent-infant psychotherapy participants was because initially I was only recruiting from the parent-infant psychotherapy group, but for numerous reasons I just didn't have enough parents who were working with social services who were experiencing that service. So I had to kind of widen the net and include local authorities as well. But as I said, recruitment was by far the biggest challenge, and it kind of stalled my progress in terms of years, because I did this part-time more than anything else. But the more I researched and the more I kind of got to know the parents that I was working with, I was fully understanding of why the idea of becoming involved in this research project might feel really quite anxiety provoking, overwhelming. I was saying to Tracy yesterday, just the idea of if I myself had gone into a residential assessment unit, having just had my daughter, and somebody wanted to start interviewing me 3 times over the next few months and asking me about my experience, coming from a place of no attachment-based trauma, I would have been like, absolutely not, there's just way too much going on here. And then the other side of it being coming from a place of attachment-based trauma and having a general, completely understandable distrust in kind of other people, but especially within this kind of professional setting. So I had to make it very, very clear to participants But anything they were telling me was going to be separate from the process of the assessment they were in, unless it was something obviously significant that needed to be passed on. But you know, they had to just trust that, and I was asking a lot of them to open up to me in the way that they did. And as I said, I will be forever grateful for the 17 of them that did take part in this, because it was a massive thing for them to agree to do for me. So in terms of the actual interviews, the design was qualitative based. So it didn't involve numbers and numerical data and statistics. It was much more sit down interviews with participants, where I would ask them a series of questions, and the period of interviews went over about 6 months, and that meant for those that were in proceedings, which was the majority of them, by that time period the final hearing had occurred, and therefore I knew what that outcome was going to be, if that child was going to be permanently removed from their care or not. So the first interview that I did with them was really getting a feel for their understanding of the reason why they were in the placement they were in. So their understanding of why they come to be known to social services, what their understanding of social services concerns and worries were, and just getting a picture solely from their perspective of why they thought they were kind of in those placements and being offered that intervention. Also their thoughts on placement, so how they were feeling, what their expectations were about how those placements were going to work in terms of support. Their relationship with their child social worker. I wanted to kind of start the ball rolling and just discussing about what that was like for them, and also any of their sort of previous experiences of therapeutic intervention. I used the working model of the child interview, which is actually freely available online if anybody would like to kind of look into it, and pull out some questions there. It's something that you can be trained in to kind of code for mentalization, but equally these questions are really well put, and I think they lend themselves very nicely to discussions about pregnancy, the postnatal period, having the baby, and then as a toddler, and then also thinking about their sort of future care of that child as well. And then the last thing that was included in that first interview was a trauma symptom checklist. So again, this is something that's readily available online, but if you were going to use it and be calculating and using the score, then that requires training. But I used it not because I was giving them a numerical score, but rather I wanted to talk to them about whether they experienced these symptoms. And for some of them, despite the trauma they'd been through, they'd never had a conversation about that before. They'd never had a conversation about some of these things they might be feeling. And I'll talk later about what some of those symptoms were and the presence of them. So then the second interview took place maybe between a month and 2 or 3 months later. And that was the adult attachment interview. So I've been trained to use that interview to actually code for the capacity to mentalize. But it also is an interview that, again, the questions are written so well that it lends itself to a parent really opening up about those childhood experiences, about those attachment experiences. So I used it for that as well, and purposefully didn't go in straight away with that sort of interview, because it's something that, you know, it's quite a personal, detailed exploration of someone's childhood. So I knew that I needed to have got a sense from a participant first of all about them understanding me and some form of sort of a relationship before we did that interview. And then the third interview was once these placements had finished, because most of these placements were over within about 12 weeks. And I met up with them and we talked about their reflections on the placement, the staff, if they were in residential, their foster carer, if they were in that sort of placement, again, touched on their relationship with the social worker. And then I repeated that trauma symptom checklist as well. Then all of those interviews were, they'd all been recorded at the time, and then I transcribed them verbatim to then ensure that I had clear kind of scripts for the next stage of analysis. So my analysis was, I used thematic analysis, so I won't go into the nitty-gritty of the process of that. Research methods is not everybody's extreme passion and interest. It's definitely not mine. So essentially thematic analysis starts with reading your data, so me reading these transcripts of our interviews, generating initial codes, and then from those initial codes looking at whether themes have emerged, and then from those themes whether there's also some sub-themes within there as well. And really my goal was I wanted to identify if there were common codes or themes that seemed to exist between those participants who had a successful outcome, so those who their child remained in their care, and those whose child was removed from them. So was there any common themes there that were kind of coming out in relation to the outcome of the intervention? And thank goodness I was very pleased after many hours of transcribing and coding that there were very, very clear themes actually that were established between those who were having a positive outcome and those that had a negative outcome. And essentially those themes became the factors the influencing factors in relation to the outcomes of the intervention. So this table just lists what these were, and in the process of putting all of this together, me and my PhD supervisor, who was David Shemmings, decided to come up with the terminology for the themes or the factors that related to those parents that had a positive outcome that were present in the interviews. We termed those change facilitators. So the idea being that if these things are present, it may give somebody more of a chance for a successful outcome if they find themselves in this situation. Equally, the right-hand side of the table is the factors associated with people that had a negative outcome, so had their child removed from their care, and we term these change inhibitors. So the idea that these factors were contributing to somebody's difficulty and somebody's struggles in being able to have a successful outcome and for their child to remain in their care. So what I want to do now is just give you a really brief summary, because this is only a short webinar. I could talk about this all day in depth, but I'm just going to give you a brief summary of what each of these factors were. And like I said, if you kind of want to hear more about one or more of these, please go to the results section of my thesis and you can hear firsthand what the descriptions from parents of how these came to be, because that's, I feel, far more powerful than just me simply describing. I don't feel like it's doing it justice, but we're short of time today. So the first one, acceptance. So this really summarized for this group, again, the people that had a positive outcome, it came through very strongly in the interviews that they accepted why they happened to be in that situation, why maybe in the past the mistakes that they may have made if previous children had been removed. They accepted that they needed to have the intervention that they were currently experiencing. And yeah, just a general acceptance for being in the situation that they were in, the current concerns, the current risks, and also previous ones as well. And there was a sense of, you know, is this something that, are they just saying this, you know, is this really a genuine feeling? But I think because it was so strong in that group and it didn't exist at all in the other group, it felt like it was a very genuine sense and genuine present theme for this group. The next was determination. So something else that came out quite strongly within the interviews was a sense from these parents that they were going to do whatever it took in order to achieve a positive outcome. They were just so determined to leave those placements with their babies. I mean, one example, a mum said to me, look, if someone said you need to go and sit in a cage with a bear in order to keep your child, I would do it. You know, I would do absolutely anything. I would sacrifice anything. That's actually a direct quote. I would sacrifice anything. So that came through so strongly. And again, this was something that was quite absent in the other group. Thirdly, mentalization. So that many of you probably will be familiar with that term, but essentially mentalization is about being able to make links between thoughts, feelings, and behavior in self and other. So in terms of being able to think about it for yourself, so being able to think, I was feeling really upset and really hurt, and that's why I said what I said, or that's why I did what I did. Equally, for another person, being able to think, okay, she was really angry that I did that, and that's why she's just said that, or that's why she chose to do that to me. So being able to really clearly make the link between thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And it is a fundamental part of parenting, being able to mentalize for your child, being able to think about what is in your child's mind and connect with that in order to give a kind of attuned, sensitive response. So being mindful, what is in my child's mind, and therefore that's why they're behaving the way that they are, and that's therefore how I make a decision about what they need from me. So fundamental to the attachment relationship. And this was coming through pretty strongly again in this group, in the way that they spoke about their children. I mean, I will just dip into a couple of quotes to just capture this. So one of the mums said she's really frightened of the hairdryer and the shower and sometimes the toilet, so I had to get her used to it by slowly putting it down really low and showing her there's nothing to be scared of. So mentalizing, okay, this is something that's making her feel fearful. This is what I need to do in order to remove some of that fearful behavior. A couple of other examples. When she gets the boobie, the smile on her face, that is her way of saying, yes, I've been waiting for that all day. So that is going to the stage of actually giving the voice of the child, actually, which is something that is part of an intervention process often, psychotherapeutically, in that parent-infant setting, being able to actually voice your child, even though they can't yet speak. That's a real mentalized task. And interesting, that mum actually had borderline personality disorder. So one of the mums who was in this group had borderline personality disorder, and that's something that really kind of threw me off, because a lot of the writing, a lot of Peter Fonagy's work is showing how people with borderline personality disorder really struggle to mentalize, but she absolutely was the best at it, you know, from all of my participants and actually in my practice experience as well. So it just goes to show a diagnosis, you know, it does not mean that that's we can't take everything from that label and make it a judgment on purely that. Anyway, so that was a really strong theme. Also within there was the capacity to mentalize in relation to thinking about themselves and their relationship with their potentially abusive parent. So that came through really strong in that dialogue as well. Basically being able to think that it wasn't talk about the connection of what their parents were thinking and feeling at the time, and that's why they behaved in the way that they did. So whizzing through, positive talk about the baby, pretty self-explanatory, but these parents, it was coming through quite strongly in their discussions that they were delighting in these babies, that they were talking there was a kind of ignition of emotion, which is quite key to something I'll talk about in a minute in relation to the other group. But they experienced such joy and delight, and they wanted to show me multiple videos and photos of these babies. And again, sadly, that was an element that was really missing in the other group. An angel in the nursery was something that was present for these parents. Now that is a term from Alicia Lieberman that basically describes this idea of, in your own childhood, having had somebody that was able to offer you a positive experience of a close attachment relationship. So sometimes that's a grandparent, sometimes that's a teacher or a football coach or a rainbows leader, someone who is showing you that you are almost worthy of care, and that positive relationships can exist. And the idea behind this research and this theory is that it can buffer the effects of that trauma in childhood. And this is something that came through for this group as well. Then we had internal working model being intact. So this essentially describes the idea of you have an internal working model for yourself that holds all of your thoughts and feelings about yourself, and that pretty much impacts on how you interact with other people and your behavior, and it's formed from your own experiences, mainly in childhood. So that's what starts to formulate our thoughts about ourselves, comes from those experiences. Now, one thing that came through quite clearly again with this group is that their working model of themselves somehow managed to remain intact, in the sense that what often happens with people who've experienced childhood abuse and trauma is they can start to internalize that they were somehow deserving of this abuse, that they were nasty and horrible and naughty. And the problem then is that somebody starts to behave in a way that fits with that model, and it has a knock-on effect throughout potentially their lifetime. But this group, their internal working model, they were saying things to me like, my dad was just he would behave in a way that was very nasty and not the way that other dads were behaving. And I felt like I deserved a dad who didn't behave like that. I wanted another dad. I wanted a dad that behaved like my friends, and just held on to this notion that he deserved more, that he was deserving of love and care. Another mum said in one of my interviews that she used to fantasize about being rescued by a fairy godmother. Now, she therefore had the self-worth, even at 7 years old, to think she was worthy of that, right? She was worthy of being rescued. So this internal working model of the self being protected was, I think, quite a significant, theme that came through quite uniquely in this piece of research. The last few here, so caring for siblings. So this group had experience almost like their caregiving system had been switched on a little bit earlier, because they also were taking care of siblings when they were younger. They also had a sense of feeling loved and cared for by somebody, right? Someone currently, either they were in a relationship, or they felt that from a grandparent, or interestingly, quite a few people mentioned the people that had a therapist, mentioned the therapist. One of my participants even mentioned me. She felt that I was somebody who was taking an interest in her and cared for her, which I have to say I genuinely did. And it was quite heartwarming and tragic at the same time for her to say that about me. But I kind of understood where she was coming from. And then lastly, with this group, the connection to trauma. So I'm not qualified to be able to diagnose whether trauma is unresolved or resolved. But what I could see quite clearly is that in this group, they had equally awfully traumatic experiences to the other group. It wasn't that their trauma was any less than the group that weren't successful. The experiences were as horrific, but they were able to talk about it in a way that that made sense, that was clear, that was detailed, and that is something that is more closely linked to coming to a place of resolution. So that was a clear factor there. Moving on then to the other group, so the negative outcome group, the change inhibitors. So this, one of the themes which is quite the opposite to the one on the other line, as you can see, is denial. So this group, when I talked to them, they had all the same questions as the other group. When I talked to them about their understanding of the reason for being in placement, any concerns, any risks that social services might have had, they were in such a defensive mindset of denial. So just not being able to accept the concerns that existed in the past or in the present. I mean, one dad gave me such a jumbled explanation. It didn't even make sense of what he was saying. Somewhere in there, he spoke about that his partner's dad had raped her, and then there was neglect, and that's basically sort of why they ended up being there. I'm trying to find the quote now to read a little bit of it. So I do know some, because with our past, with our children, it was like she said that her dad raped her and I didn't know anything about that. Now, this was a couple who actually, this was their 6th baby. And for him to be in a place where he is not able to articulate the process of what has actually happened and what those concerns are, and an understanding of that, is so huge to actually now being able to make any change, right? If he's not mentally in a place where he has processed any of this, regardless of whether there's a learning disability, it's about someone having, you know, even a basic level of understanding about that, which is possible. You know, he can communicate with you. So that was huge for me. I just thought, it's such a jumble. You know, he's been through so much trauma of his own and the losses of these children, and somehow this is all just completely mixed up in his mind and fed into kind of a complete defensive mindset of denial. And obviously somebody can't start to make any changes in anything if they're sitting in that place. And I think that's quite true of quite a lot of parents that we do work with. Secondly, low mentalization, so quite the opposite of the group that I've just described and some of those descriptions, just a real struggle to connect with what their babies were thinking and feeling, almost giving their baby quite a negative persona, perceiving that they are being persecutory towards them, so purposefully crying to upset them, annoy them, irritate them, punish them. Again, please go look at the quotes to kind of summarize some of that stuff if you need a bit more clarity on it. Then negative talk about the baby. So obviously parenting a newborn babies, it's a challenge to anybody, right? So it's not that this is such a terrible thing that they've got anything negative to say about the process of parenting, because most people would. But it was just the kind of the content of this, and the fact that it didn't seem to exist in the other group as well. But again, please do look in more detail about those quotes. Then lastly, the last two, disconnect with trauma. So unlike the other group, their dialogue when trying to recall events in relation to their own trauma was very kind of incoherent and just disconnected from what they were saying. They'd be saying something potentially, you know, very traumatic that they'd gone through, but that they had sort of like brushed it off or let it, or to quote, let it go over their head, when it was something really, really severe. But again, that's just so kind of common in relation to thinking about operating from the brain's way of dealing with trauma and being in a defensive state and using defense mechanisms to get through pretty much everyday life. But sadly, using those defense mechanisms is not a factor that's going to contribute very easily to changing behavior in any way. And then lastly, just a lack of change facilitators. So this group had a lack of these things listed on the side in that table there. And just to sort of evidence that, I've got a couple of slides about that in a second. So in terms of thinking about participant intervention outcome distribution, the main things I want you to look at here is that the people that had the most positive outcomes were in foster placements. So that was 4 participants. People that had the most negative outcomes were in residential placements. Now, I haven't got time today to go into detail about feedback about the placements, but again, that's in my thesis in the results section if that's something that you are interested in. But what was very clear was that the foster placement was offering a much more nurturing environment that so many of them benefited from, that a residential assessment unit does not offer and cannot offer. And I'm all for understanding that in high risk situations, you might need an assessment unit with a camera and observations taking place every 10 15 minutes, like the one I worked in. But the tragic thing I really felt was that those parents that were put in those residential units, they were almost even more in need of that more nurturing experience. So, you know, that's something that I hope to kind of try and take somewhere else, because I'm fully aware that residential assessments more often than not are not offering that. They are simply offering observations and a kind of a lack of this sort of more therapeutic way of working with families. And there's something tragic in that, because those high-risk families, as I said, they need that even more. So yeah, and then just a little bit of a distribution to show how strongly, really, this table shows how strongly the distribution of the positive factors were with those participants who had a positive outcome. So this is all of the 9 participants with a positive outcome. None of them were showing those other factors. None of them were showing the change inhibitors at all. Equally, those that had a negative outcome, majority of these factors that were the change inhibitors are there in the bottom section. And just a couple of the more positive ones were present there. Okay, so I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip on to this bit to make sure that we've got enough time for any questions if there are, because I've seen a couple of things pop up in the chat box. So essentially, key things to be taking away from this is that the key change facilitators were acceptance, a sense of determination, being able to mentalize, and having a connection to trauma. And for me, that therefore means that we need to be doing more to make sure that our intervention is offering a chance to increase these change facilitators, that we are doing the right thing by families, that we are offering them the right types of intervention that will give them an increased likelihood of these factors being present for them. And I think it comes down to something I often say, which is, we cannot keep operating from a very business type model where we just come into a family, we identify the risks, we identify the concerns, we write down what they need to do differently, and we basically give them almost like a business model review of checking that they've met these objectives. You know, this is so much more complex than that. We need to be knowing why they're in the situation that they're in, and we need to be offering them the right types of intervention to facilitate change, to facilitate these factors being present for them. And equally, the key change inhibitors are denial, low mentalization, and a disconnect with past trauma. So again, we need to be offering intervention that reduces the presence of these things, that tackles denial, that manages to create a shift from that place, because it's possible, right? There's evidence, more than enough research and evidence to demonstrate that. And again, intervention that's mentalization based, video based, whatever it might be, just making this sort of stuff more available. Obviously, I'm going to talk about financial implications of that at the very end, but it's worth discussing. And also just dealing with the fact that this disconnect with past trauma, I don't have time to go into it today, but for many of you that have been to my lectures, you know that that has a significant impact on parenting and the difficulties and the struggles that are occurring. Okay, so I'm just going to whiz through this. Relationships with the social worker. So themes that came up in relation to this very quickly. So misinterpretation, being in a relationship with the child's social worker whereby you potentially are misinterpreting their behavior, they're misinterpreting yours, and being mindful of the fact that someone with a trauma history may be more likely to misinterpret quite neutral behavior. So a facial expression, a smile, that could be misinterpreted. And again, through the dialogue with participants, that was quite clearly happening on occasions. Confusion over role, feeling like this social worker isn't sticking up for you in meetings, feeling like the social worker, your property hasn't benefited from having a social worker. That was one of the quotes that I had. So thinking that kind of housing housing benefit should have come from this role and this relationship. And that's obviously going to cause some negative feeling when that didn't happen. Lack of transparency, this was huge. So parents feeling like they are hearing new information at meetings about them, hearing new concerns at meetings, new information at court. You know, wherever possible, we've got to share information. If we want to shift from a denial mindset, we've got to share information in a space that feels comfortable for reflection and discussion, not a meeting full of professionals. And I understand why there's some information that, for safety reasons, let's say, isn't shared prior to meetings. But more often than not, if we can be having these conversations before it gets to that stage in a more kind of intimate setting, we're more likely to see some change and shift. Tunnel vision, feeling as if a social worker's view is just solely that, and there's no option of being able to see things from the parent's perspective. Perfect parent fallacy. So I talk about this one quite a lot sometimes in my research, in my lectures. This idea of adding far too many things into the mix that you want a parent to tackle, to the point where they then they feel so overwhelmed they can't tackle the most important things, they can't tackle the most significant things. And an example of that might be adding in concerns about a child not being offered healthy enough food, or still having a dummy, or still having a bottle. I'm not downplaying those things, but in terms of actually risk to a child, there probably are much more significant things in the mix. So if we add too many things onto this parent's plate, then they might not be able to focus on any of them. They might not be able to focus on the most significant things. And that was feedback from the parents feeling overwhelmed by this sense of being this perfect parent. Feeling a sense of a lack of empathy, and just the relationship inducing kind of traumatic symptoms. So feeling anxious, feeling stressed, feeling sick, you know, anything associated with having that interaction with the social worker creating that trauma symptom. And obviously, if that's what's going on, then in those interactions, somebody isn't going to be interacting with you in a rational, calm part of their brain. If they have an association with you that induces traumatic symptoms, then they're going to be probably operating from a fight, flight, freeze mode when they're actually having interactions with you. So being really mindful of that too. Lastly, ideal social work qualities that they've said we want to see: understanding, compassion, openness. Pretty straightforward. So very lastly, key messages from this research. The importance of using an attachment and trauma lens to understand parents' behaviour in that process of intervention, in the process of assessment and intervention, being mindful of these change facilitators and change inhibitors and incorporating them into that process. I've got in brackets there about being mindful of a hyper-aroused state. That all of the parents that were unsuccessful in this research project, their trauma was impacting their brain in a way not where they were hyper-aroused. So these weren't parents that were hugely aggressive or violent or angry. Their trauma had essentially caused them to operate in a hyper-aroused state. So to be very shut down and disconnected emotionally to any sort of close relationship. And that had a massive impact on their ability to do what the other parents were doing, which is that sense of delight, that sense of like emotionally ignited by your child. And that was really, really clear for me, and quite a kind of tragic part of the finding when I kind of delved more into the reading around that. Relationship-based practice, the importance of that, the importance of using this knowledge within those relationships. All of the participants had a negative relationship with their social workers, regardless of outcome, regardless of local authority. You know, I talked to people that everyone was from a different local authority, and they were giving similar kind of feedback. Being aware of secondary trauma for practitioners, and the importance of reflective therapeutic supervision. I try and talk about that a lot in my lectures as well. And when I go to conferences, it's so key, because it's very difficult to do the relationship-based practice, to maintain the empathy, to prevent burnout if you yourself are suffering from the kind of secondary trauma in the process of working with families in these settings. Okay, I'm not going to read out this slide, but for anyone that's interested, you'll be able to see on the recording of this. It's just the savings that can be made essentially by if we were to put family into therapy once a week or twice a week, as opposed to the process of proceedings and adoption. The savings are huge. It's very, very clear. I know it's not as clean cut as that, because some families, the intervention and the risk is so high they do need immediate removal, but it's just simply kind of food for thought and discussion. Last slide here is just my email address. I've just started an Instagram for talking about my work and my research and lectures or conferences that I'm doing, so please do follow me on there. And then lastly, that's an actual link to the publication. If there are parts of this you'd like to just pick up, there's quite a detailed contents page, so you can just dip into bits that might be helpful. So yeah, that's it. Whistle stop tour. Hope that